Well, I love that. I love that. There's kind of some interesting and cool juju in the room, if
There's
you
some
will.
juju. There's
Yeah.
some real juju here.
Yeah.
Yeah. This
Um,
is also the bar where, right next to me is the bar where a lot of time was spent by my adult, not by me, but my aunts and uncles and grandparents. So,
nice.
which is another story.
Well, I think since we're live, we might as well
Yeah.
welcome everyone to the first inaugural Flying Carpet Theater Family History Discussion Series. And Pete and I are going to be co-hosts of the series, but we thought since we each went through this kind of process ourselves that we would get a chance to interview each other, partially for us to get a little bit of practice. This is such a new thing that we thought we should use each other as guinea pigs, I guess.
Yeah.
And Pete and I have known each other since high school, but we also sort of thought that, yeah, in some ways you know somebody, but some of the stuff we're going to talk about is not typical fodder for conversation. So I think Pete and I are going to presumably share a bunch of stuff we've never shared with each other, and maybe in some cases with anybody. So with that, I guess we can kick off. The general format for these things is that we're going to talk about kind of how we began with family history. We talk about the amnesia and the awareness chapter of our work with family history, and then to the degree that there was some search, we'll talk about that, and then details about our family's histories, and then swing back to what it all means to us. Does that make sense?
Makes sense to me.
Cool. So you want to kick off, Pete, I guess I'll ask you this and then you can flip it back.
Yeah.
Did you grow up with a huge awareness of your family beyond your parents and maybe grandparents?
No, not really. I think I knew the sort of Cliff's Notes version of my family history that never really got elaborated upon until I started kind of digging myself. And
what's the Cliff Notes?
The Cliff Notes version is I speaking now about my father's side of the family. So on my mom's side, there was a little bit more kind of knowledge about family history that was passed down, mainly because, when I was growing up, they lived in Columbus, and a lot of those cousins still lived in Columbus and still do. My mom, the house that she grew up in is still there. My aunt just sold it a few years ago. So there was kind of this living connection that remains in Columbus. And Columbus is Columbus, Georgia is it's a different world than Atlanta in a lot of ways. And but the Atlanta side of the family, it was weird because like I had, my family name is like, it's not uncommon to see it on like road signs and buildings and stuff like around Atlanta. So it's kind of always there. But the part, and I don't know, this would make sort of an interesting subject of reflection for me, is how much of that sort of took the place of kind of a serious investigation in my own family. But basically the part that I got, I never really got much from my grandparents, because my grandfather had Alzheimer's when I was a teenager, and then my grandmother had it as well. So she lived about 10 years longer than he did. So I never really got to know them as adults, and so never had any kinds of conversations about these sorts of things. But then going back a couple generations, there were three people in my family that were like the main characters, the dramatis personae of my family, and they were a great uncle Asa, his brother Warren, and his younger brother John, who was my great grandfather. And these three men loom really large in the kind of Candler sort of mythology or whatever that I received. One was, it started Coca-Cola. The other one was a bishop and a chancellor of Emory University, and then John was a judge, Supreme Court justice, a state Supreme Court justice. So they were known.
Your direct ancestor.
My direct ancestor was a lawyer. Yeah, so I came from a lawyer, and but the three of them were known. Well, basically to me as just Asa, the bishop, and the judge, and that was kind of it. That was really sort of all I knew, and I knew they had brothers and sisters too. And what emerged from when I started to dig a little bit more was a really pretty fascinating group of people who were very complicated, put it that way. So yeah, that was a Cliff's Notes version, I think.
I'll come clean and say, so, having grown up in Atlanta, I had my bar mitzvah party at this place called Callan Castle.
Yes.
Which you're probably aware of. And then, my sister sang at Callan Wald.
Yeah.
And then, of course, every year we take visitors to the Coke Museum, and so I certainly grew up hearing the name Candler. I can't remember a time I wasn't aware that there was a family called the Candlers that were important in Atlanta history.
Mm-hmm.
And then, I'm pretty sure that early in high school, when we knew each other, somebody said, Pete's connected to the Atlanta Candler family. So, I don't think I have any awareness of you as not being part of that. In other words, you probably know or must know that like that name and local, and kind of local lore looms large, and that you probably have known that you've had an identity in some sense as being one of the gang, from your whole life, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Would people stop you and be like, "Hey, are you connected to these Candlers or what have you?" as you were growing up, or no?
I've had, and so I think part of that, has made me really distance myself from all that for a long time, because it was just like, I just
right.
You kind of want to be known as an individual, not sort of attached to whatever people think. And I have had that a number of times. In fact, when I was teaching at Baylor in Texas years ago, I remember a colleague came up to me and said, he did that sort of wink, "Oh, you're that Candler family." And I said, "Yeah." And he kind of looked at me really seriously. He said, "I know what that name means." And I thought, well, maybe you could tell me, because I'm not, I don't really have any idea. And so there is that, there is this weird feeling of kind of, you don't know what people or what other people do associate that name with. I think Coca-Cola is obviously a big one, but now I have a much better picture of the things that I hope they don't associate that name with, because I know a little bit of the family history better than I did 2 years ago.
Yeah. Well, let's perhaps just to quick follow up on one of those questions. I just want to say that at some point I think we should circle back to that notion of known as individual and separate from family, and what is, I think that plays in certainly to, I think, a lot of people's relationship to family history, and especially in this country.
Yeah. Let's
Um,
do. Yeah.
should we just for symmetry, you want to kind of ping pong, or what we haven't quite figured out?
Yeah. Sure. I mean, I think when we first started talking about this, I didn't have any sense that my own kind of curiosity about my family's history would in any way interest other people, and I think that's one of the things that I still feel sometimes a little bit like, is this kind of a narcissistic sort of thing to just be talking about my great uncles and cousins who've been dead for 150 something 100 years, maybe not that long, um but and when you started digging into your family history, it was really it was I suddenly felt maybe like what it was like on the other side, because I found what you were uncovering was fascinating, and the fact that we both had at this same period in our lives this experience of kind of discovering something new about ourselves and about where we come from, that we both had. I think, and I don't want to speak for you, but I definitely got the feel that you've talked about this before, how you just started getting obsessed with this, and kind of we felt like you were becoming really annoying at the dinner table and stuff because it's all you would talk about.
Yeah.
So how did that, like, what was that like? Because I mean, I think we both had this sense of like opening a hidden closet or something.
Yeah, I think that's well said.
Yeah.
So I come from a pretty big family,
Yeah.
meaning my mother had many sisters and many cousins. My father's close with a lot of his extended cousins. And, it was a source of some tension when we had our wedding, because like I rolled in with this guest list of non-negotiable family members that had to be invited, and Nicole was like, that's big, So
Can I just interrupt you real quick? Were y'all married in Atlanta?
We were married in New York.
Oh, in New York. Okay.
And both sides of my family, at least perceptually, hail from the Northeast. My father's wing from Boston, my mother's from New York City. But there was some branches seemed to possibly be in other places at other times. I didn't really know. I sort of knew them as kind of the Boston and the New York branches. And really, I knew my grandparents. I knew three of my grandparents, and I had warm relationships with them. And so I never felt like I didn't come from anywhere.
Yeah.
But there was really only one grandparent that ever talked about his young family life. And so I had a little bit of a tiny sense of that. And beyond that, part of it is, really curiosity. It just never occurred to me to think about it.
Yeah.
But if you had pressed me about it, growing up in the South, you're certainly aware that some people take lineage as a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
But like in my family, if you had kind of pressured me, I could have been like, these are the names of my grandparents, and maybe I have a vague memory of one or two of my great grandparents from an elementary school project. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that it wasn't for at the moment, there wasn't any shame, or it didn't seem like any taboo or anything like that. It was just it just wasn't a subject. There were, like the family. So I kind of perceived that we, jump started our family life in about, 1915 or what have you, when my grandparents came online. What happened before? Then it sort of felt like a leapfrog. It's kind of like, well, what happened before, since we're Eastern European Jewish, we were just part of this larger narrative that was depersonalized, that like I could have told you a good bit about Jewish history from a schooling and whatnot, but it was like larger cultural sweep right into my grandparents, and that's all I knew, really. And again, I want to emphasize, I don't think anybody in the family perceived that there were any secrets that were being hidden or anything.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was just a general lack of interest, which is another big topic. You know, what does that lack of interest stem from?
Yeah. I mean, this is making me think about, you know, what are the causes or conditions that lead to this kind of lack of interest? I'm not sure. I mean, I think in my own case, it probably isn't unrelated to, you know, the fact that my grandparents suffered, you know, pretty significant memory loss by the time I was of an age where I might be starting to get interested in this. And then my grandfather, his father, died when he was like 16. So the sort of continuity wasn't really there, I guess, in terms of the sort of transmission of the oral tradition. When you're talking about your grandparents, you know, on my mom's side, my mom's grandmother, she lived to be 100, and she was, you know, she never suffered any sort of dementia or anything. So she had kind of that sort of family memory lived for a long time, and I think still does. So, but I don't know. I mean, this. What do you think, or why do you think that lack of interest is such a common phenomenon? I mean, it's certainly common for us. I mean, I suspect it's common for other people. What do you think that comes from?
Well, I guess, you know, the positive spin in our family is people were in the present tense. They were doing things. For the most part, none of my folks came from, you know, wealth or grand stations. So there wasn't like any need to pass down a narrative about like, and, you know, so it just, there wasn't a paper trail or a footprint, right? There was kind of this forward trajectory. Here we are, we're going to keep kind of doing our thing in America. And I guess as we continue down this conversation, I mean, some of the things I discovered may have led to part of the culture of quiet. You know, I think I hadn't fully, I mean, I sort of knew generally, but I hadn't fully pictured it. But like town by town, as I kind of discovered where my ancestors were from, there at about the time that my gang left, there had been kind of catalytic events, pogroms or massive, poverty with edicts attached to it that made it even harder to earn money, or that sort of thing for the ghettoized Jewish communities from the places where my people were from. So I think that led to an incredibly strong distaste for talking about the old world. Mm-hmm. You know, like, why would you? There's nothing to celebrate. So the thing that makes me a little sad, though, kind of connected to that, is that one of the big discoveries is that people came over with big clans. Like, my narrative was, if anything, had to do only with my great-grandparents. But my great-grandparents' generation, in some cases, they came over with their parents. You know, they're like 50-year-old great-grandparents, my great-great-grandparents on boats. And they came over with siblings and that sort of a thing. So like, and they were often living, you know, within blocks of each other. And often one person was coming, making money, sending it back, bringing over boatloads of people. None of that was talked about. The sort of like the breadth of the clan circa 1900, not talked about at all. Nobody had any awareness. Like, when I started sharing that, every relative I shared it with was kind of like, what? You know? So,
and was this in New York? Originally, when they first came over, was that
New York, Atlantic City, interestingly. We had a big clan in Atlantic City that I never knew about, near some of these monopoly streets, like,
Oh, right. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
Boston, New York, and Atlantic City.
I mean, but you've lived in New York.
Yeah.
So did that make you feel a kind of deeper connection to that city, or to I mean, maybe even Atlantic City, or Boston? Do you feel like that, just, learning more about that connection? I mean, you may have known that much to begin with, but do you feel a sense of like some weird sort of, I don't know,
place or something like that?
Yeah, I mean,
candidly, I can't explain it. Not especially. I guess to the degree that I have any feeling like that, I thought it'd be sort of fun to go with my camera, and because you can see the addresses that all of your ancestors lived, and just sort of take a picture of the place that they were at for when they came over, just to kind of give myself almost like a visual sense of the trajectory. But I guess one of the things that I do feel, I can't shake it. I won't say that I have a connection to it, but having been to Atlantic City, certainly having been to Boston a lot, and having lived in New York,
mm-hmm.
I have less of a mysterious, like, what are those places even like? I will say, as ugly as the history is there, I can't shake my curiosity of what Lithuania and Poland and Ukraine are like. Because it didn't occur to me to only recently did I know where everybody was from, and now I'm kind of curious what those towns look like, etc. What about you? Do you feel, knowing your family's history, a different connection to places in Georgia?
Yeah, I think so. And that's, a lot of this has been, as related to road trips that I've done with a mutual friend of ours, and going back 20 something years now. And I think I do have a new connection, or at least an appreciation for places that, my history is connected with, even if it's at a few generations distance. But most of it is all pretty tightly around Atlanta. I mean, it wasn't, they're the Candlers that came to Atlanta or Villa Rica before it was Atlanta, like in the I think 1830s or something like that. So it was, Atlanta may not have even really gotten going yet.
Where did they come from?
Well, I think they had you can actually kind of trace the trajectory from what I know from the story as it's been written down. Is I think they landed in sort of Virginia in about 1736 or something like that. Maybe in 1756. I have to remember that, look that up. I think it's somewhere around there. Anyway, middle of the 18th century. And then gradually, 1756, that's right. And then gradually you can sort of trace this by a map, because there's a Candler Mountain in Lynchburg, Virginia, which is where I ended up for a while. And we're part of a Quaker community. And apparently one of the Lynch family were part of that Quaker community too. So the Candlers were a part of that group, and then eventually sort of kept moving south, and there's a Candler in outside of Asheville. So like further down the Appalachian range, that was named much later, but I think they've been there for a long time. And then eventually my group ended up in Carroll County, in Villa Rica mainly, somewhere in the early to mid 19th century. And they've been there ever since. And so I have I can't say I feel a very strong connection to Lynchburg, Virginia, but I do feel, we just that have been in Atlanta for so long. I do feel like my appreciation for Atlanta has grown in sense understanding a little bit more of this history.
So just to clarify, when they came in 1756, from what country in general?
Well, see, here's where the myths start to set in, and this is why I felt like so intrigued by, your discovery of your family's narrative up to transatlantic crossing, so to speak, was so different, but and this kind of role of memory and amnesia, or kind of slightly, remolding the story. When we were talking about, there wasn't like a hero in the past that your ancestors were trying to trace their lineage to. It was more like we were trying to get away from something horrible in Lithuania and the Ukraine. In my case, and this goes back to your first question, the story about the family legend, so to speak, that I grew up with was William Candler, who was Irish. And I could never quite make sense of this because it didn't. The story was that, as I remember it, and this may not be the exact way it was handed on to me, but William was Irish. He fell in love with a Scottish woman. That was taboo in Ireland. He was kind of ostracized by the family and not forced, but he chose to leave Ireland and sail to America because of this woman. He loved, it's romance. He loved
true love,
true love. And, it was a great story. And he started a new life eventually, I think he ended up in, I left this part out. I think he ended up in, over near Augusta. So anyway, yeah, that was the story. I learned later that, and so I do remember, like, this idea of Irishness at some point came into the self-consciousness of the Candler family. Like, we are Irish. And, everybody wants to be Irish, I guess. Who doesn't want to claim Ireland as the motherland? But it turns out that's not exactly true. In fact, it's not at all true. And when you were talking about Callanwald, like Callan Castle and Callanwald, the Candlers have made a lot of this connection to the ancestral home, Callan in Ireland. Those two places are both named after a village in the southeast of Ireland called Callan that is supposed to have been the ancestral home of the Candler family, which sounds awesome. That sounds like a great myth. And I've had aunts and uncles who have been back there over the years to try to find the old family home. And I grew up hearing that it was a castle there. Well, it won't surprise you to learn there is no castle. And the relationship to Callan in Ireland is very tenuous. In fact, the way that William Candler and his people before him came to Callan in Ireland was not because they were Irish. In fact, quite the opposite. Another William, 100 years before, came to Ireland with Oliver Cromwell as an invader, and as a reward for his services to Cromwell was given a manor house in Callan. I mean, was given, we say, but it was stolen from someone else, I'm sure, and given to William, the first William. And so that makes us not Irish at all, but very English, the worst kind of English, which is colonial sort of invader, Puritan England. So that kind of upset the family myth a little bit. But it does get to this idea of like, you want to find that connection to some ennobling personage in your past that you might think gives you something to hang on to, something to aspire to, or something like that. But in my case, it was not. There was almost no truth to it.
I'll be curious. I think you're right that is a common thread, that people sort of look around for the hero, the ennobling figure, that sort of a thing. I think that is a major strand of the sort of genealogical seeker. I don't think it's certainly the only one.
Yeah.
For
sure. Yeah.
Nor do I. I don't think you were saying that either. I'm just saying, one of the things that I think will be fascinating as we keep going is to sort of parse out some of these categories, right? Of like, why do people look backwards? What is it for? And, what are they seeking when they look into their own family history? And I think what you just said is a common theme, but I think almost always what's interesting to me is that even if that's where you started your search, it's rare that the outcome of your search is, and I found we were connected to King so-and-so, and that isn't that great, and then the rest of it I don't care about. You know what I mean? I find that as people look for the particular ancestor, it's actually the bigger picture that starts to resonate. Again, that's.
Completely agree. And I think I think for both of us, my sense is that what was so compelling about learning this information and learning about these people was that history suddenly became very real and very personal, and not, I'm talking about American history or Atlanta history or world history. Like these were no longer subjects of textbooks. These were, we were talking about people who were involved in this, that whose actions led to very real consequences, and that we still live with. And so, but I wanted to ask you, like, what was it that prompted your search? If it wasn't kind of like, I want to find, I certainly didn't start out trying to find the connection to,
Right. I know.
Find a good English king. But what was it that, what flipped the switch for you?
I'll start by saying I don't know that I could give you a good answer. I can tell you when I was a student in France, I crashed with a friend of my uncle's for a while, and he was in his 40s, and he said he was getting really into atavism.
Yeah.
And I had to look up what that word even meant, activism or something like that in French. And, it's about connection to ancestors and that sort of a thing. And I kind of rolled my eyes. It's like, who gives a hot flame? I can't believe you're into that. And I remember some vague notion of thinking that will never be me. Who cares? My recent search was catalyzed by an assignment in my daughter's Hebrew school class where we had to make a family tree. And I didn't know much. And so the process of doing it got me addicted to the sort of puzzle pieces of like, and I can find out more. And I realized, and it was kind of an epiphany about curiosity too, which is like, I didn't even realize I was curious about this.
Yeah.
When you don't know something, it's kind of like you don't know what you don't know, right? So I didn't know that I didn't know any of this in a sense. I didn't know where anybody came from, and it hadn't bothered me. I hadn't thought to think about it. But the process, I guess, of none of it was a surprise per se. You know, my father, who is very underwhelmed by all of this search, still sort of rolls his eyes when I tell him granular details and says things like, we told you you were Eastern European Jewish.
What more do you want?
You found out you were Eastern European Jewish. What else do you need to, what else is there?
Yeah.
But I guess for me, like, there's a difference between the general category of Eastern European Jewish and knowing about Vabalninkus, Lithuania, and who the people who left there were, and what year it was, and why they would have wanted to leave, or knowing that people came from a town in Romania that had a very particular history with the Holocaust. I guess also a piece to this that let's not ignore is if you grow up Jewish, you're aware of historic anti-Semitism. Also, I'll be the first to say, like, it's been a privileged century for Jews in the U.S., and certainly my family has benefited from all of the ways in which we've been, I think we can talk about this later, but, not being the main minority that people oppress means that you can kind of grow in a way in the U.S. Whereas in Europe, that may have been true for my family. So all of which to say, I think that instead of it just sort of being general, like the Holocaust was bad, you're Jewish, you probably have some connection to it. Like learning which family members perished, where they lived, being able to look at pictures of them and in some way honor them simply by remembering them and saying their name has had this value to me. And I guess it goes back to my eye rolling of that French dude, like I get it now, I think. And also I've done a little bit of research on the whole phenomenon of family history and genealogy. And I think that mid-40s is kind of when a lot of people start. It's a common life experience for people. I think it's connected to sensing your mortality, having your own family, wanting to know how you connect to it all. So like, I don't have any incredible deep insights. But what about you? Was there a trigger for you that sent you off on a more specific search?
Well, it just make sure I come back to this quote from James Baldwin that I found very. Apparently there's a leaf blower going on outside. Sorry about that. So, let me know if it gets too loud, and then I'll mute myself, and then you can tell some stories with it. I mean, what prompted mine was it wasn't really a choice. I think I've told you I had lunch with a friend of mine in Asheville who's a historian, and he said, there's a book you need to read. And I said, okay, that's good. I like reading books, especially recommended by professional historians. And he said, it concerns your family. And I was like, okay, then he told me the title, and the title was At the Altar of Lynching, The Burning of Sam Hose. I had never heard of Sam Hose before. This was late 2017. This was barely 3 years ago. Not quite 3 years ago. I kind of thumbed through the index a little bit, and I saw there was there was a lot of talk about Candler people in there. But it was a book about the most notorious spectacle lynching in Georgia's history that most of us never learned about, and most of us still don't know about. And it happened in Noonan in 1899. Well, I kind of set, maybe out of fear of what I was going to discover, I think I set it aside. I occasionally glance at it, but talking about like finding that hidden closet, like I didn't know what was gonna come out of that closet. So I think I just set it aside for a while, and then in the following April, I was down in Montgomery. I was writing a piece about the the lynching memorial, the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, which had just opened. And it was for an assignment for a magazine. And I happened to get there in a classic Pete move. I sort of got there, and the memorial itself was closed that day, but the bookshop was open. So I wandered around the bookshop, and I found a book on the history of lynching of African Americans called "At the Hands of Persons Unknown" by Philip Dre. And it's a really powerful and, as you can imagine, deeply disturbing book. But it begins with the Sam Hose story. And on page 2 is Allen Candler, who was the governor of Georgia at the time. And I think once I started to notice these connections, I couldn't avoid them anymore. I couldn't just put the book that my friend David had recommended to me aside for a while. I had to just I had to figure out what this was all about. And so in a way, it was kind of not a choice. It was a provocation, it was provoked by the sort of confrontation I didn't really ask for, but I'm glad that it happened, because it led to a very interesting on one level, but also it forced me to really rethink a lot of what think for the first time about stuff in connection with my own family history that might otherwise have just laid dormant.
So tell us a little bit more specifically about the lynching in 1899 that you read about and your family's role.
So April 12th, I think it was, April 12th, 1899, Sam Hose was an African-American man working on the property of a man called Alfred Cranford in Noonan. It's about 40 miles south of Atlanta. And his mother was ill. She lived in Peach County, I think, to the east of Noonan. And he asked Cranford, his employer, if he could go visit his ailing mother. And apparently he refused. And they kind of left it there. And the next day, Hose, who also went by several different names, whether he went by different names, a number of different names are attributed to him. But Sam Holt, Thomas Wilkes, I think, is another one. But anyway, it's usually called Sam Hose. And he approached Cranford again on the following day and asked if he could go visit his mother. And apparently, of course, we have no eyewitnesses to this. But what most scholars believe happened is that Cranford pulled a gun on Sam Hose, and Hose, I got it backwards. It was Cranford that approached Hose on the second day, who was chopping wood at the time, and harassed him about this issue and pulled a gun on him. And in self-defense, Sam Hose hurled the axe at him and killed him. So there's no dispute that what Sam Hose did, about that part, that he was responsible for Cranford's murder. Of course, later, and immediately he fled. He apparently fled to his mother's place. There was a manhunt for 10 days. And in the meantime, the press just made the allegations of his crime more and more extravagant. And of course, in 1899, the fear of a race riot was daily fodder on newspapers in the South and maybe even in the North too. Well, ultimately, a lynching took place in on April 23rd. And it was, I won't describe the details of it because it's just too horrific to repeat right now. And, but Alan, who would have been my great-great-grandfather's first cousin, was the governor at the time. He himself issued a reward for Hose's capture. Well, and Alan Candler was not an opponent of lynching. And after the lynching of Sam Hose, he issued a statement for the Constitution in which he said, basically, he described the crime of Sam Hose as the most diabolical in the annals of crime. That was the direct quote. The most diabolical in the annals of crime. And yet, if you learn the details of what happened to Sam Hose in Noonan, and you sort of, not to compare these two things, but it is interesting that that Alan Candler chose to describe Hose's crime as the most diabolical in the annals of crime, and not what as many as possibly 5,000 white men did to Sam Hose over the course of hours. So, and that was so. And then my great grandfather John, who would later become the judge, was a colonel of the state militia, sent down to the area at the time to basically protect the white interests and white property and stuff. And so here this was a direct family connection to this horrific episode in Georgia's history. And I never heard a word of it until I happened to stumble upon, the two books that I didn't stumble upon them, but one of them I did, but the other one was suggested to me. So until I started to encounter that story, I had never came up.
And just for context, do you know if the players involved that you just mentioned had fought for the Confederacy, and do you know if any of them had been slave owners?
Alan Candler, the governor, had fought in the Civil War for the Confederacy. He fought in the Battle of Jonesboro, and a number of different others too. But at Jonesboro is where he lost an eye, and that's where he earned the nickname the One-Eyed Plowboy of Pigeon Roost. And John, my great-great-grandfather, was born in 1861, so he was been too young to have fought for the Confederacy. His father, Samuel, was a slaveholder, one of the largest slaveholders in Carroll County, which is another fact that I, somehow never came up either. And his eldest son, Milton, so it would have been my great-great-grandfather's oldest brother, was a member of the state legislature, and I believe he served in the Confederate Army, who in 1868 initiated a motion in the Georgia Senate to have newly seated African-American legislators removed from office under very spurious legal stipulations. And so his motion actually failed, but it was in the Senate, and it was taken up in the House where it succeeded. And there was a moment in 1868 where 33 African-American legislators were just removed from their seats because they were black. And this was the sort of collapse of Reconstruction. Well, not the collapse just yet, but it was the resistance to Reconstruction orchestrated by a great uncle.
So do you, when all these discoveries were made in the last couple of years, Pete, and you were the discoverer of them, did you decide, well, I'll start with my brother and share this, or did you like call a family meeting, or how did you deal with the information? What does it look like when you find out stuff that argue is different from finding an ennobling ancestor in that sense?
Yeah. I probably did, I don't know if this was the best or worst way possible, but I think I had been writing some of this stuff on a Deeper South, like a little bit about here and there about these connections. But the first time it really kind of all came out was in an article I wrote for the Los Angeles Review of Books in 2019, which is not, I don't know if that was the best way to, but I think I was deliberate about not necessarily sharing a lot of this with members of my family because I did not want them to talk me out of publishing something like this, but they wouldn't have, in fairness. And I think I've been really encouraged by, my dad's generation in particular about how this has provoked for a lot of them an interest in this story too, and not a kind of defensiveness, quite the opposite. That's been really interesting and encouraging for me. And so I'm not sure that, I'm sure there are probably other better ways to handle this, but I think just from a kind of writer's perspective, I wanted to be able to tell the story in my own way without a whole lot of kind of having to think about how the family might think about this.
Sure.
Interestingly, that I got a message from someone on Facebook the other day that heard our conversation with Lois Reitzes on WABE, and she wrote to me and said, "I heard you and Adam on the radio and was really intrigued. And by the way, I am the great granddaughter of Alan Candler." And
wow.
Yeah. So.
And did she know some of the things you were saying?
I think she knows more than I do. Yeah. So definitely she knows more than I do because, she's got some of that stuff has made it down to her, or she's picked it up in other ways. So,
one of the things that I'm sort of, I think family history as a general rule is always sort of looked at through the lens of the present. When you look back, right? I was in a different family history sort of webinar a few days ago, and the host said the past is a foreign country. Its mores, its habits, its values are completely different from where we are right now. And when you look back at behavior, you have to think of it that way. And So, in thinking about how you can imagine that in 2020, your discoveries play one way. Mm-hmm. In 1980, they would have had a different emotional weight for the people who discovered them if they were a discovery. Or the other thing is, I think you sort of even what the questions you ask and what you look for is also very much defined by the present. But I guess I bring that up to say, I wonder, knowing, now that you and your family know this stuff, it's gone from sort of amnesia to awareness. Mm-hmm. How has that changed in some way how you organize your own self or what the story of you is? I mean, are you bound by your ancestors in some way?
I mean, yes and no. I think having kids, it definitely makes me want to be very deliberate about not sort of silencing this history. I want them to understand it because I think it's also a way for them to understand the larger world that they, are a part of, and their connection to Atlanta history, Georgia history, American history as agents, and maybe not all, historically not on the right side, if we can talk about a right side of history, so I think I've told you the story before about driving down to Atlanta with my second son, Charlie, who was about 9 at the time. And we went to see Alan Candler's grave in Gainesville. And I wanted to show him some of the sites that I was just learning about myself. And so sites related to my, great grandfather, his dad, and that generation. So I wanted him to grow up at least with a connection to that history and to that place that would make, at least he would be, the very least I could do him would be to give him a more richly furnished mental habitation in terms of the understanding of his family.
If I can interrupt for a second,
Yeah.
I mean, I think for me, one of the things that's been powerful, and as I've heard other stories, this has rung true, is that specificity and truth or fact are always, in a way, useful and appreciated, right? Even if there was a mythology that seemed to energize for some amount of time, there's something powerful about knowing something deeper than that. So I can imagine that if you're giving your kids something that is factual, that's ultimately more soul enriching. Again, this is just a value of mine, but I think it's more soul enriching for people than it is a received narrative that in the end has to do with the agendas of the people who are telling it and not about the facts on the ground,
Yeah, I mean, and you're an artist, whose work revolves around, storytelling a lot. And I think, you appreciate and understand the power of detail and the power of specific facts or settings or circumstances that make, great drama doesn't originate out of general realities. It is born from specific ones. And I think that's what, I mean, and again, like the role of place is very important, I think, too, especially in Atlanta, where, has been historically such a placeless place, or a kind of, a non-place in a way, to use Walker Percy's term. But those details can both, they can affect a sort of connection, but also humanize the subject too. I mean, which is the harder part, because it'd be really easy to take someone like Alan Candler or Milton Candler, or who were white supremacists, and completely just turn them into sort of unambiguous villains. Which is why, it's a little harder to do that, I guess, when they're your kin, because I don't have any interest in defending, I'm not interested in the mythology, or in that ennobling figure, because I think maybe this goes back to this whole question about the bigger motive. It's like, these are some human beings with some really, really deep darkness in them. And I guess there's part of me that's like, as an artist or someone who tries to be one or thinking this way, that, you know, that story by Eudora Welty, Where's the Voice Coming From?
I don't know it.
She wrote this story about after the assassination of Medgar Evers. And she wrote this story from the perspective of his assassin. And which is a really bold move artistically, you know, and to try and understand a pariah, I mean, an evil person. Like there's no ambiguity about that. But it was a courageous move and an incredible story about trying to, you know, as a writer, someone like Welty, trying to get inside the head of somebody, like what would motivate a person like this. And I'm not sure I have that kind of courage, to be honest. Like I even just like at an artistic level, I hope have at a personal level, because, you know, that's a very, very difficult and very, very fraught and dangerous thing to do. But I think it's like art. That's where art.
You mean like almost like take a step into your ancestors' point of view and live there for a second and try and imagine. I mean, yeah. I guess I'm struck as I think of like how people, I've gone to a couple of these genealogy sort of webinars or sort of conversations. And I would say, as if I made a generalization, people are apt to spend more time talking about the more heroic figures, unsurprisingly, in their past, right? But even the people, as you said, their kin, even people who aren't, you know, by modern standards, they didn't, you know, they weren't, it wasn't a uncomplicated or clean or moral life by our standards. You know, people have a weird higher degree of empathy for those people in their own family trees than they might if they read about them in the newspaper, which itself is, I think, is a fascinating thing, because you want to understand before you judge.
Yeah.
And I wonder, you know, is that a useful thing for people to go through that personally? Because it, you know, maybe we think about criminal justice differently. If you're, you know, the question first was, I want to understand what the context of this is before I judge.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, on that trip that I took with Charlie, where we went to Atlanta, you know, and passed through Gainesville, he and I spent about 3 hours in the Rose Manuscript and Rare Books Library at Emory, which was itself a kind of heroic thing for a 9-year-old to do. Mm-hmm. And maybe a form of abuse on my part, but he dug it, you know. And a lot of the papers there are from Warren, you know, who has a strong connection to Emory. So and I was reading just like letters to his kids about certain financial entanglements towards the end of his life. And there's a side of him that I've never, and Warren, by the way, you know, was not Alan Candler. Like he was a vocal opponent of lynching in the early 1900s. And I mean, in many ways, a really impressive and courageous figure himself, you know. And so I do want to say, like, there were all there are both of these kinds of figures in basically the same generation. But anyway, going through his papers, I just felt like this really profound sense of pity in a way, and I don't mean that in a demeaning or pejorative sense, but like of and especially because these were written at the end of his life, and he was, kind of settling his accounts, and he just seemed like some of them were receipts, like for various things. And it's like, here is a picture of a very human life, a very human being that was not just the judge or the bishop, and there's a bust of Warren it used to be in the main entry of Candler Theological Seminary at Emory. And I mean, it's not the most flattering thing because it sort of cuts off right here, and he was, I guess, a large man. So you can tell that he's very prodigious in size, and he just looks so mad. I mean, he's got this, and you do see him this way in pictures. He's just sort of scowling and really irritated. And, that was an image I had from my 20s of him, and that was about it. But so filling in this, it was a great privilege to have access to some of those materials that fill in this picture where this is a real person, a human being that, and interestingly, like if there's any hero for me of that generation, it's probably him. And yet I have this sense of him as, or just from those papers, an impression of him late in life that's struck me as very sad, and or at least not that he was a sad person, but that I felt really fortunate to have a window into some sort of emotional access to him as a person, if that makes any sense.
It does. If we could just to leapfrog from that you were able to go and kind of check out this archive, and that there's this footprint of so many people in your family.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's worth bringing up a couple of layers. I know it's a common word these days, but a couple of layers of privilege I discovered in my own family tree, and then some gaps that aren't there that other people have as a privilege, and I didn't even think about them or know about them. So I did all those DNA tests, to sort of. So the first step I did once I got the bug is I kind of created a family tree to the best of my ability.
Yeah.
And a lot of it ends in about 1870, and I did a lot of work, but pretty much, one thing that is true for a lot of people who've been on American soil, especially people of European descent,
mm-hmm.
is that they can do these long family trees pretty easily.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Immigrants, people who came over in one of those waves, or people who had been enslaved, mm-hmm. usually find that their family trees kind of come online, even if they've done the work, at about, for enslaved folks, I'm making a generalization here, but that 1870 census was a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
And, for people of my, the big wave of Jewish immigration, you're usually lucky if you can kind of get the parents of the people who came over. So that's starting at around, again, our family trees essentially come online at 1880, which is an unusual sensation, right? Like, I did all this work and I went from 1910 in my imagination, and after months of work, I got to 1880. And that felt like a huge deal, but it's an unusual thing. And I think I was talking with a friend who's in a sense got a similar family tree and background to you in terms of length of time on American soil, white guy.
Mm-hmm.
Big footprint on a lot of historical places. And he joked, he said, all genealogists are star fuckers. And I said, what does that mean? And he said, I don't think it means what you think it might mean. It doesn't mean, it isn't only the search for the ennobling ancestor.
Yeah.
It's that when we go back, we're so happy to find any record. And the records and the history tend to be around people who are of wealth and station.
Mhm.
And historically, those tend to be white guys.
Yep.
And so, like one thing in my own family tree is how hard it is. How I can go much further back on many lines on the male sides because of in the records you see what the last names are. Like for when you do genealogical research, in a lot of cases, it's terrible, but the women fall off the map because of this, and you see that incredibly true. And then if people didn't have money or didn't have, there was no, wasn't like there was anything passed down. There were no shoe boxes or anything. There's no place to go to read about them. So it becomes a very different kind of exercise. I will say, going to the DNA test, a privileged thing that I acknowledge is sort of just a lucky quirk of fate, is that for the sort of 16, if you go up to the great-great-grandparents level, the family that I was told about is the family that I have, meaning like the family tree matches up with what's in my DNA pretty deliberately and clearly. And one of the things that I've spoken with several friends about that makes it real complicated is when you have what the genealogists call non-paternity events. When a family tree forks, and it could have been 3 generations ago, and you now no longer know who's whom, etc. So there are all these levels of things that you can discover when you kind of go back. But again, I want to quickly jump to this sort of who gets privileged in a family history. First of all, acknowledge it, right? You get to read about, be it Asa or Sam or Alan, because they have a certain kind of footprint. Right. And in my own life, that's, it's less true because of the scale and scope, but certainly the males heavily privileged. I'll tell you one story of something I discovered that was really mind-blowing. And I don't have a great context for it, but I would love to, learn more. My mother's grandmother was evidently a baker in Ukraine, in a small town in Ukraine, right? So my mother's grandmother and grandfather came over to the US and lived in New York. And then I guess the family lore, which I didn't know was family lore until I started digging, was that they didn't get along very well. So my great-grandmother, and this is kind of mind-blowing given the economies, went back to Ukraine, in the early 1900s, and brought the family with her, left the guy, and went back to work for her mother in this bakery. Now, the family lore was it was a bagel shop, but I think that was a later addition, just based on culture, So she works in the bagel shop, and then the great-great-grandmother says, "You can't leave your husband back in the U.S. You can stay here for a little bit, but you got to head back." So then they all, inclusive of the baker great-great-grandmother, come back to the U.S. and then start having a few more kids back in the U.S., even with this, not incredibly romantic marriage. Yeah. But it conjures up a couple of things, like what kind of strength of character did my great-great-grandmother have to be like, F this, I'm taking the 3 kids back. If you look at what those journeys were like, it's like multiple days in steerage in both directions. Right. Mm-hmm. Then you hit some port. Then it's like 3 days on a crappy train to get back to the main town, and then some sort of like a horse and buggy back to your little town. So, I mean, kind of like painting the picture of that kind of like intrigued me, and it intrigued me that there was like lore about this strong woman in the family, which is it's kind of stands unique related to what a lot of the other, stories were. And gosh, if things had played a slightly different way, if she had just been so committed to hating my great-great-grandfather and they had stayed there, that would have been a real bad situation for them too,
Yeah, exactly.
So I'm glad, it's interesting that she left, and it's also, I'm glad she came back,
Yeah, I mean, it's any one of, we talked a little bit about this in the past about the contingency of things, like how any of those decisions, if they had been different, you might not be here. And I think that's part of it, that like, and the human part of it is that these stories about these people, they constitute who we are. I mean, we wouldn't be here. You and I wouldn't be here if something different, had gone, if some tiny decision had gone differently, we wouldn't be having this conversation. It just, and that's like the part of it that makes you feel kind of, almost overwhelmed with just like how freakishly accidental each of us is. Like, you didn't have to be here. So many things had to go a certain way at a cellular level for us to be having this conversation right now. And go back to the privilege thing. I think that's such an important part of this, because there's no question that my story is a story of white privilege, of being a kind of powerful family in the late 19th and early 20th century. And the only reason I know a lot of this stuff is because it was written down. It was in the newspaper. There's a paper trail. There were women who, in that generation, who did all of the archival kind of work. There's a big book in Emory Library that's like some sort of governmental document. It's like this thick, that one of the sisters in that generation she did all the collecting, not anonymously. And those stories are much harder to kind of parse out. But it's the photographer Sally Mann wrote about something like this, and with respect to photography, in her book Hold Still, which is her memoir. She talks about how in her own life and experience, she has memories of things where she doesn't have photographs for them. Memories of experiences for which she does not have a photograph. And experiences for which she has a photograph, she tends to not have a memory of those things, if that makes sense. So in other words, it's as if the photograph does the work for the memory, the brain work for the memory. And it's almost like a surrogate for it. So it's like if you have a photograph of an experience, like your kids playing on the beach, you don't need the memory for it, or it like replaces the memory. And I sometimes feel like I wonder if the same isn't true about this documentation part, because in my case, I knew that like all this documentation was there. I had the family tree. I had the pieces were there somewhere. And I sometimes wonder if that meant that I didn't have to do the work myself, or, you know what I mean? Like it took the place of what you've described, is having to reconstruct that stuff, and having to, even just the labor it took for you to get from 1910 to 1880, like that, it's just, if you can assume it's there, it's almost like that's amnesia a little bit, like you don't have to remember it.
Right. It's so, that'll be interesting as we speak with different people, that you and I have this different relationship to amnesia, and depending on who we're speaking with, each of us will be able to ask questions that have to do with our own experience of it. Yeah. Both the outsider's view of it and the insider's view of it, because it's coming to that generation, the 1880s, from a totally different lens in a way, isn't it?
Does it make you feel, though, that you have to you have a responsibility now then to preserve this sort of documentation? I mean, because now that you've got, like, you're building the tree and you're going, you're putting this all together. If you don't do it.
Right. Yeah, for sure. I mean, I would say, weirdly, there's a couple of other layers to it. Forget the book, right? This is highly personal, and I don't know that it's broadly applicable, but it's changed a little bit my relationship to what it means to be ethnically Jewish. And, when you see kind of a monolithic story of a certain kind of small town Jewish pious life for many generations, and then a kind of immigrant story thereafter, I guess I just, even, if my kids marry differently or raise their kids differently, that's their choice. But I wouldn't want them, I wouldn't want this whole history to be forgotten.
Yeah.
That's kind of how, that like people suffered and sacrificed and in a very specific set of historical contexts. And given that how specificity is important, like I wouldn't want in 3 generations somebody like one of my great-great-grandkids or something taking a DNA test and being like, hey, I'm a 5th Ashkenazi, or wait, you're not a 5th, but you know what I mean, as a 6th Ashkenazi Jewish or whatever it is, an 8th. Yeah. And that was some pretty bad genealogical. An 8th. Right? Yeah.
A 5th might be interesting.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. That's a different story there. Yeah.
Right, but you get what I'm saying. That like, to me, if even though we had amnesia, we sort of knew culturally the context. And now that I see how consistent it was across multiple branches, it would terrify me that specificity wasn't passed down in some way.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily need my kids to be beholden to that past in a way that feels oppressive to them, but I would sure not want them to have no relationship to it.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I guess it's like you can kind of put them in the position, put your children in the position to choose whether or not they want to have a relationship to that history, I guess. But it's not taking it off the table, so that it, in a weird way, which isn't giving, it's sort of taking the power away from them.
Right. You could just see how many people, like I took my DNA test. I have, many of my cousins extended, far out cousins, still, people sort of stayed connected to that ethnicity up until about my generation. And I wonder if also there's sort of a pattern of forgetting that. And, that's a different conversation for what that all means. But I guess I'm just saying one of the epiphanies for me about family history is now that I know it and have the luxury to know it, I would like to preserve it in some way and pass it along.
And so, I think, I feel that too. And this is where I feel a strange kind of connection to Alan Candler, as weird as that is, because, as much as he has become like the person I do not want to be in this story, he was like the family archivist and like the family historian, and he was actually the state historian for a while, and recorded he's responsible for tons and tons of shelf space of Confederate and Revolutionary War records of the state of Georgia, which is incredibly boring reading but important stuff. And so now I kind of feel like, have I sort of inherited this position of like the documentarian or whatever, because nobody else is interested in it, or nobody else is going to do it. But also, like, I feel like there's something, I want my kids to have at least the option of engaging with that history. And going back to like what we started talking about with the Candler thing, and I think for a long time I kept a lot of that at an arm's length, because I didn't want like that whole individuality thing, and I don't want my own sense of self to be sort of determined by whatever the, like my colleague claimed, I know what that name means. And yet in a weird way, like understanding the darker part of that family history has made me a little bit more, a lot warmer to embracing that. Like, because I think at least I have a bigger picture of the family history. So I feel like I can be less deluded about it,
What does it mean, like if you're in a conversation with a colleague or a friend who has African American descent and is from the same places as you, how does that change that conversation, knowing does it ever come up? Will you say, if somebody starts talking about their family history, will you bring up yours? Is it awkward? Is it something that's upfront? Do people appreciate, in your experience, you're being upfront about what your family's history has been?
I don't know. I haven't had any. I can't say that I've had any conversations with African American friends directly about this. How about this kind of thing, apart from text messages and Facebook comments and stuff like that, back and forth. But I think my MO is just to keep engaging with it and probing it and being honest about it and trying not to flinch when something comes up that really is painful. So I think I really feel like I'm sort of still at the stage of trying to get the fragments back together, the fragments of this history, getting a little bit better sense of the whole. And if that somehow if someone appreciates that for what it is, then that's great but I do feel like that kind of feels like my vocation at the moment, is to just,
as I hear you speak, Pete, I'm thinking in some ways the criteria for a great play have an overlap with the criteria for how each of us are thinking about family history, in that a lot of dramas have a very clear story and they're compelling in their clarity. They've got, good villains and heroes, and there's the kind of melodrama, or the clarity of it draws you in. And that can be powerful. But the things that are like truly great have that story, but also an incredible amount of balancing nuance, that there's no character who's any one thing, right? And in some ways our kind of forays into family history, if they've kind of gone from the general to the specific, and in doing that, you go from a clear narrative, that sort of what you might call the melodramatic narrative. There's the villain oppressors of Eastern Europe, and the heroic people who get on the ship and leave, and et cetera, in my case, and perhaps in your case, the sort of heroic handlers who built the South, right? And then there's the opposite of like, well, they weren't, whatever that opposite is. And then, things shake out, and there's something very satisfying about the warts and all narrative.
Yeah. And it's like, you can recognize yourself in that, and I think that there's what you just said is I think cuts to the heart of this, it is where art and theater in particular maybe can prompt a very salutary intervention in a culture that right now seems to really favor simple 240 character version of reality. So the idea of nuance is anathema in a lot of circles right now because it takes too much time, and it doesn't. It's and I can understand that. I really can. I mean, we feel like we're in a moment of incredible urgency with respect to race, and race in particular. And when there's not a lot of time for there isn't a lot of room for nuance about certain things, but it's also essential because, and I think maybe the genre of drama or theater, the environment or the situation of theater is uniquely situated to kind of draw that nuance out.
Mm. Well, on that note, we're at 90 minutes.
Yeah.
I think we should end our Zoom and continue the we get to have this weekly. We get to
yeah. Yes, we do.
So we will pick up here soon. We're going to end our Facebook Live too. Thank you, Pete.
Thank you, Adam.
I feel like I know you better.
Well, I feel like I know you better too. I confess I miss the mustache.
Yeah, I'll pop a picture up on Facebook for you.
Is there a mustache filter you can get for Zoom? Do they have that technology yet?
Yeah, I'd have to maybe paint my face white here or something. I'll check in with you soon, and
sounds good.
Great to chat.
Great to chat with you too.